Good morning. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner.
Let's get all the latest in news. Ed Baxter is covering everything for us from the 960 newsroom in San Francisco. Ed?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Israel promising a ground component to its war against Hamas. Timing is the issue now. Iran calling a spread of the war inevitable. That is Iran, a signal it is preparing. And Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Tel Aviv says already some of those components.
There's also a tension that's splitting to the north, where there have been increased skirmishes with Lebanon. We understand that the Israeli government has now evacuated all of the civilians on the border with Lebanon 2 kilometers out. So this is the other question that we're watching. And of course, the U.S. response has been to send a second aircraft carrier unit into the region to, again, try to step up the deterrence a little bit more.
Meanwhile, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horduran says President Biden still thinking about making another trip to Israel.
This will be a huge deterrence for the region about the U.S.'s president. It also comes at a time that the U.S. is sending a second carrier strike group to the eastern Mediterranean. We should not overlook the timing of all of this. So potentially the president could go as soon as this week, but Jonathan, we should note no decision has been made.
And Anne-Marie says there are back channels between the U.S. and Iran working, and day-to-day life in Tel Aviv is very tense. CTV correspondent Adrian Gabriel describes events earlier today on Bloomberg.
Just about 15 minutes ago, we were running for cover because air raid sirens were sounding yet again here in Tel Aviv. There was about, I believe, 3 separate air raid sirens throughout central, eastern Tel Aviv throughout the afternoon today. And so in one word, it's unpredictable.
He says restaurants are closed. Supermarkets lightly traveled, and for the most part, people are hunkering down at home. And a warning going out today from doctors about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Gabriel Naumann, who's with Doctors Without Borders, says no water means tragedy.
We need to have water installed back to the entire Gaza Strip, not only to the south, but to everyone.
He says food and electricity are major problems. So again, timing, the big question of when Israel goes in on the ground. Republican nominee for House Speaker Jim Jordan says there will be vote tomorrow and that he has picked up critical support.
It's not about pressuring anybody, it's just about we got to have a speaker. You can't open the House and do the work of the American people and help our dearest and closest friend Israel if you don't have a speaker. So we get the speaker. We get the House open, and we get to work on the resolution.
Now, Jordan picked up support from Armed Services Chair Mike Roberts and Wagner, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee as well. And Jonathan Tamari, Bloomberg reporter, says Jordan is getting much, much closer.
He has gotten a lot closer today than he was when you spoke to Congressman Huizenga at the end of last week. We have seen numerous mainstream Republicans even the number of people who have been very resistant to Jim Jordan, come out and say they've had conversations with him, they've had assurances, they're now supporting it.
And there's also been pressure campaign from conservative wing of the party, as well as the fact that Jim Jordan is the Trump pick. And speaking of Trump, the judge in the January 6th trial in D.C. has slapped a limited gag order on him. Bloomberg's Zoe Tillman starting here.
Starting out sort of more narrowly tailored and say the consequence for pushing the limit too far is to restrict him further in what he can say about the case. I've talked with sources who have been on the bench before who have said there can be things like monetary sanctions, a daily fine.
Now, it leaves him to be able to attack his political opponents, so we'll see what Trump does with that. Global News powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries in San Francisco. I'm Ed Baxter, and this is Bloomberg. All right, Brian.
Ed, thanks very much. We will be looking very closely at this story all throughout the program. Interesting developments with Israel's defense minister saying expect a long war. We'll put that to our guest, Alex Trayman, coming up, the Jerusalem bureau chief at the Jewish News Syndicate, and also looking at Russian President Vladimir Putin getting involved, talking to Egypt and Iran and Syria and the Palestinian Authority, and the impact on markets. We had a positive day today. Why? That's all coming up. Now, in the top angles, the Palestinian envoy to China has asked Beijing to play a role in ending the war. Ambassador Fariz Madawi cited moves that are currently underway by Western officials in trying to prevent a spillover in the Middle East. Here's Madawi speaking earlier with Bloomberg.
We need to stop what's going on. People are dying, and we need to address this situation. It's the obligation of the international community. We are urging, not only Palestinian, but the all Arab countries are urging everybody. We need joint, coordinated efforts really to make this happen.
Madawi did not specify exactly how Beijing could try to play a role in the war. However, his comments are the latest in a chorus of voices looking for Beijing to step up its efforts. Over the weekend, the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken had urged China to use its influence to prevent other actors from entering the conflict. Paul?
Well, Apple's new iPhone 15 appears to be selling far worse in China than the earlier generation. Separate studies are pointing to essentially weak consumption. Counterpoint Research says over the first 17 days of release, sales of the new iPhone were down 4.5% compared with the release of the iPhone 14. Meantime, analysts over at Jefferies believe iPhone 15 sales were down double digit as Huawei outsold Apple. Here's Bloomberg's Alex Webb.
We have seen a slowing of sales in China. It's not really dropped significantly, but if you look at trailing 12-month sales, there has certainly been a flattening. The key question is whether this is to do with a sort of resurgence of Chinese nationalism and a real gusto going behind Huawei's new headline device, which may not be able to maybe able to manufacture that many units, but is that something that's taking chunks out of Apple? Or secondly, is it just the Chinese economy? And if it's just the Chinese economy, then if that economy recovers, Apple will recover too.
That is Bloomberg's Alex Webb. By the way, shares in Apple were a little changed today here in New York. Brian?
All right. Thanks very much, Doug. Well, China is kicking off its third Belt and Road Forum today in Beijing, with geopolitical tensions hanging over the gathering. We get more now from Bloomberg's Joanne Wong in Hong Kong.
President Xi Jinping's big project faces a degree of criticism from developing nations heavily laden with debt. The event has attracted dignitaries from around the world, including Russian President Vladimir Putin. A meeting between Xi and Putin may gather more attention than the forum itself. The meeting will aim to further strengthen ties between China and Russia. That's as the two try to distance themselves from U.S. pressure. The Belt and Road Initiative suffered a blow last month after Italy told China it intends to quit. The forum runs today through tomorrow. In Hong Kong, I'm Joanne Wong, Bloomberg Radio.
Today, there was a wild swing in the price of Bitcoin. That story from Bloomberg's Ann Cates.
The largest digital asset was whipsawed after a false report circulated that the U.S. had approved a long-awaited exchange-traded fund. BlackRock said that its application for an ETF that invests directly in cryptocurrency is still under review. The episode suggests there remains a lot of excitement and hope for a spot Bitcoin product in the U.S., which regulators in the past have refused to allow. The Securities and Exchange Commission previously cited market manipulation, among other reasons, for not granting an endorsement. In Washington, Ann Cates, Bloomberg Radio.
So again, the Bitcoin price topping 30,000 at one point, now holding at 28,443. Meantime, some of the biggest U.S. banks, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, are scheduled to report earnings this week. We get more from Bloomberg's Sri Natarajan.
Those three also happen to be the three worst performing big bank stocks. Slightly different dynamics. With Bank of America, you'd be looking at what are they saying about the economy? What are they saying about loan losses? Because that's what we heard from JP Morgan and Wells Fargo. Despite improving their NII outlook, JP, Wells, and even Citigroup talked about loan losses increasing on the forward. With Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, however, all the commentary and all the focus will be where are they seeing the rebound in investment banking activity. Will 2024 look way better than where it is right now? Because when they report their third quarter results, investment banking results will still be depressed, and perhaps that's a reason for why the stocks, both at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, are down about 9 and 10% this year.
That's Bloomberg's Sri Natarajan. Bank of America and Goldman Sachs report earnings tomorrow, Morgan Stanley then on Wednesday. Let's get to Alex Trayman, Jerusalem bureau chief at Jewish News Syndicate. Alex, thanks very much for being with us. So Israel says prepare for a long war. Is that good news or bad news for civilians? Does it mean a more careful war by the IDF?
Well, the terror jihad that has been on Israel's borders in the south with Hamas, and also to Israel's north with Hezbollah, and even with inside Israel in Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, and even inside Israeli cities, it's a very complex threat, and it will take time to go inside of booby-trapped cities inside of Gaza and to try to extract hostages, and at the same time to take out Hamas's terror leadership and to completely diminish their military capacity. I don't see any way in which the IDF could obliterate that threat and change the name of the game in just a very short period of time.
Alex, of course, people in Israel are used to living in the shadow of these sorts of threats, less so a conflict of this scale, though. So what's the mood on the ground in Jerusalem right now and in Israel more broadly?
Well, there's a lot of tension. Israel's been under rocket fire for over a week. In Jerusalem, we were forced to run into the bomb shelters after air raid sirens, and we heard booms over the city. And there was even a strike not far from the outskirts of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's been one of the quieter places. Also, a major tension because over 300,000 troops have been amassed surrounding the Gaza envelope, and every Israeli knows somebody, has a brother, a sister, a daughter, a father that is called up to duty, and there's a lot of tension because the ground operation has been imminent now for several days, and it continues to remain on hold. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about what is actually going to take place, even from Israel's side, in the coming days.
We heard that Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke with the leaders of Egypt and Iran and Syria and the Palestinian Authority and said that it was unanimous that a ceasefire was needed. We talked with one of your colleagues yesterday who said there is no way Israel would agree to a ceasefire now. Is that based in fact, or is it possible?
Well, first of all, I think it's humorous that Vladimir Putin is the one calling for a ceasefire. We live in an ironic age, but I don't think that a ceasefire is possible right now because the Israeli core has been shaken, and there's absolutely no way that the IDF and the Israeli leadership and, quite frankly, the Israeli people are going to live with a scenario which Hamas can infiltrate our borders, kidnap murder 1,300 Israelis, kidnap and take hostage over 200 more, and that Israel will just suffice with a few bombings over a couple of days and allow Hamas to just rearm for the next battle.
And to that point, I mean, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the plan was to wipe Hamas off the face of the earth. But is that possible, considering the leadership of Hamas doesn't actually even live in Gaza?
I think that it's completely possible to diminish Hamas's entire military capability to take out as much of the senior leadership as possible. I think you're correct that Hamas's top leaders don't live inside of Gaza, and international efforts, including efforts by Israel's own Mossad, might be taken in order to try to target Hamas's leadership. I don't think Hamas's leadership should consider themselves safe anywhere at this point.
Israel has said that it has opened up a safe corridor in the central part of Gaza for residents up in the north to get to the south. Tell us about how that is moving and, how many more people need to get out who haven't already left.
Well, hundreds of thousands of people from northern Gaza already reported moving to the south, heeding the warnings of the IDF. There were reports that Hamas itself was setting up roadblocks, trying to prevent the movement of Gazan residents southward, and there were even reports, though remain unconfirmed, that Hamas actually opened fire on individuals trying to move south. And it seems pretty clear that Hamas is hoping that Gazans will remain in place and that they will become victim of IDF air raids in order to increase the death tolls and which would increase diplomatic pressure on Israel to stop its operation.
Tell us about what's happening in the north of Israel at the moment, up by the border with Lebanon.
Sure. Well, there's been cross-border fighting for several days. Just yesterday, anti-tank missiles were fired into Israeli territory, killing one civilian. There's been mortar shells fired back from Hezbollah into northern Israel, which has been returned by IDF fire at strategic points near the border. So there's been a few. There's been also a drone was sent a few days ago and was downed over the Israeli city of Tzfat. So we're already in a low-level conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, and there's definitely the worry that all it takes is one trigger-happy Hezbollah militant to turn this into a wide-scale conflict.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcast.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.